morning, everyone.
Morning.
Morning. Good morning. Good to see you all. Welcome to Primetime, the BU Library, celebrating learning beyond the classroom. The experiences and accomplishments of other faculty, students, and staff is what Primetime is all about. It is a collaborative project between Friends of the BU Library, Faculty Development, and many other offices on campus. You can find upcoming Primetime events on the library's website, news, and events calendar. If you missed a presentation, most are recorded and can be viewed online in our BU Digital Library, also found on the library website homepage. Thursday, April 17th, come and celebrate poetry. The winners of the Shakespeare's Birthday Sonnet Contest will read their original words, and we'll celebrate poetry with words and music from faculty, staff, and student presenters. Today, we welcome Dr. J. Rasmussen and his son, Conor Rasmussen, as they share images and impressions of a country thought to be off limits to U.S. citizens in their presentation titled, Cuba Explored, Searching for the Present Reality. Let's give them a hand and welcome to the
Thank you, Pete, and thanks everyone for coming here as well. My name is Jay Rasmussen. As Keith said, I'm a professor in the education department, and then I'm also faculty development coordinator at Bethel. I've actually had two trips to Cuba. You're going to hear today mostly about the most recent trip that we took. It was kind of a family affair. My son was along, and other parts of our family as well. And for me, my first experience with Cuba was a trip to visit what's called the Latin American Studies Program, which is a Christian College Coalition program that's based out of San Jose, Costa Rica. They also do some work in Nicaragua and then also into Cuba. So May of 2012 was my first time in Cuba. I was there with about 5 other professors, and it was more of an educational study program in Cuba. And then this past December and January, I went with my entire family. When I came back after my first trip, I started showing pictures and telling stories, and turned out my entire family was interested in going, including my mom, who was 83 years old, and she was ready to venture off to Cuba. So she helped kind of bankroll our second trip to Cuba, and that's mostly what you're going to be hearing about today. I'd like Conor to briefly introduce himself, if he could, and then we'll get started.
Hello friends, thank you for coming and hanging out, spending your morning with us. I'm Conor, I'm a freshman, I'm social studies ed. I'm doing the Latin American Studies program actually next year, next fall, and I'm really excited for that. Just get back into that style of living and that style of learning. For me, I had a lot of expectations about what Cuba would be. I've read a lot of books about Cuban history, Cuban culture, that sort of thing. So for me, going there was a really interesting experience, kind of seeing what was actually there versus what I thought going into the location.
I'd also say in my 2 trips to Cuba, my impression changed pretty dramatically in my second trip versus my first trip. After my first trip, I was a little more of a, I guess I'd say, a real Cuba fan, and it looked to me like the dream was being lived out. And honestly, the second time I felt like I kind of encountered some of the pretty harsh realities, that are actually present in the country too. So we're going to be sharing some of that. When we travel as a family, Conor and I especially, we've did a motorcycle trip to Argentina. Some of you heard about that. But what we always try to do is really get the best understanding we can of a country in the limited amount of time that we're there. So we like to take what's called an EMIC view of a country, which is kind of an insider's perspective as best we can. And that comes from really talking to folks that live there, on a day-to-day basis. And then we bring an edict view as well, too. That's kind of our outsider, perspective of things. We try to do that. The one view that we're really not bringing to this presentation would be that of folks that have lived in Cuba pre-revolution and actually had their homes taken, their businesses taken. So that's a perspective that's very real with Cuba that we're not really able, to bring, at this time. So I want to introduce my wife, who just came in as well. I said this is a family affair, so Roberta, if you could just stand briefly. For a number of years, we co-led a trip to Guadalajara, Mexico, and so she's an educator as well. So Conor and I are going to tag team on this. I'm going to show us a few photos, talk a little bit about it, then we'll switch it over to Conor as well, too. And feel free to jump in with questions or comments if you want. I know we've got a couple folks in here that have been to Cuba, so feel free to jump in if you'd like as well. We started our trip in Minneapolis. It's pretty ironic. We had all these people asking us about safety in Cuba and how do you get there and all those kind of things. Well, when we went to the Humphrey terminal to leave, there was actually a bomb threat that was taking place. So we wound up with 4 hours of us cramming into this small part of the Humphrey terminal before we could get on our plane. The Bloomington bomb squad came and they found there's no bomb or anything. So we left from here. We flew to Denver then. We arrived in Denver with 8 minutes to spare before we were supposed to get on our plane. So we've got our 40-pound suitcases sprinting up escalators and through hallways, and they actually held the plane for us, which kind of only happens maybe in the United States. So we got on the plane, sweat running off as everybody breaks out and cheers that this family has arrived on the plane. So we went from Denver to Cancun. Most people that go to Cuba actually wind up either going through Mexico. Cancun's a real common place. Toronto actually is another common place to fly to Mexico from. And then in the last 2 years or so, you've been able to fly from Miami or New York to Cuba. I mean, from either Miami or New York. So that's a possibility. It's a whole lot easier, honestly, going through Cancun or going through Toronto than it is through a U.S. airport. We arrived in Cancun. I personally am not a big fan of Cancun. I try to avoid it, but it's actually our best way to get to Cuba. So spent the night in a hotel, and then the next morning we caught our flight to Havana, and it just was a good jumping off point. I'm not going to talk a lot about Cancun. When you come into Cuba, you do need to have a visa. And a Cuban visa actually is fairly easy to get right at the airport in Cancun or any of those other airports I mentioned that have direct flights to Cuba. You actually can get your visa. It costs you about $25, a very simple process. You will need your U.S. passport when you go into Cuba. The Cuban officials know that you're from the U.S. They know to really not stamp your passport, because if your Cuban passport is stamped and you come back into the United States, then you really need to produce a license showing that you were legally traveling in Cuba. And it's called a general license. You can get a license to travel in Cuba either for educational purposes, research purposes, or religious purposes. And the license that we had, our whole extended family, each of us had individual ones that was really for religious purposes. Not any organization can grant these licenses. The religious license or the other ones, you need to be approved by the State Department. And the first half of our trip actually was with a tour called Cuba Explorer. And then the last half of our time, we just wanted to go off on our own and just kind of be with people and try to understand things. But the visa you need, especially when you first enter Cuba. This is the international airport, Jose Marti International Airport. Jose Marti, who Conor's going to talk about in just a little bit, is probably, I would say, one of the top 3 most influential people in the history of Cuba. Really amazing kind of guy, and Conor will talk a little bit about him. When you come into this airport, it feels a little intimidating. There still is a bit of it feels like a Soviet influence. You kind of see it, you feel it a little bit, when you come into the airport. It is a little bit scary, and I've got to say that. Once you walk out of the airport, all of a sudden you're in Cuba, and the warmth issue of the people and the climate as well too. We were on a tour, like I said, and it's only certain companies are authorized to provide these tours. There are U.S.-based companies. There are a number of them actually in Canada as well too. We used a company called Cuba Explorer, which we were super happy with, and they arranged. This is the hotel that we actually stayed at. Anybody that's conducting a tour in Cuba needs to run it through the Cuban government, and there's one main tourism agency in Cuba. It's called San Cristobal, and they have tour guides that align then with all these different agencies that are running tours. So it's pretty heavily controlled, certainly government sanctioned. They arrange where you're going to stay when you're there. They want to create a very favorable impression. So they kind of put 4 stars on their hotel here, and it was fine. It was a great place. The food was very interesting. You could tell they were trying to appeal to a variety of interests. So they had something that was a bit typical of Cuban food, not terribly good. And then there's a lot of Europeans that traveled to Cuba, a ton of them. So you had this little European type food that they thought was European. And then there was something that was kind of resembling American food as well. Not very much of that, but the food was interesting. You can find good food, but you typically don't find it at a place that's really controlled quite a bit by the government. So after our initial tour, we went off on our own and we stayed in completely different places. But for the first part, this is where we were. Money in Cuba is also very interesting. There's 2 currencies that are there. There's what's called kooks, so it's a convertible currency. And kooks are typically what any tourist would use or anybody that has a lot of money. If you want to buy anything in Cuba that's a luxury good or even remotely a luxury good, you need to trade in kooks. And then Cubans themselves, they just work with the national peso, which does not look real pretty, like these bills. But if you actually know how to use the national currency, you can get some really good deals and live amazingly cheap, in Cuba if you'd like. Your first impression, you'll see old buildings that are in a bit of decay. That's there for sure. And then a lot of old cars. These old cars are not just in Havana. They're all over the place. And some of them look great. Some of them don't look so great. The revolution happened in '59 in Cuba. So every car basically that you see there is kind of pre-'59. There's some Soviet-made Ladas, LADAs that you'll see around too. But many Cubans refer to the country as a rolling museum. And that's really what it is. If you're a car aficionado, it's kind of an amazing place to be. Just a lot of incredible cars.
So in preparing for the trip, I like to do a lot of reading, and pretty much most of my reading was done from selective writings from this guy, Jose Marti. I forgot to bring my book, which is my mistake. I have a morning class, so I kind of stumbled here. But so yeah, Jose Marti, poet, author, revolutionary. During the Spanish-Cuban War, he actually was the leader of that revolution. That was in the late 1800s, 1893, I think it was. Really, really influential in the culture of the island. Kind of consider him the George Washington or something like that. Really fought for Cuban independence. Died in one of the first battles, which is not so good. I think he fell off his horse or something embarrassing like that. But he's a really absolute genius of a man. Was actually lived in the United States for a while, both in New York and then Florida later on. Really had some interesting things to say about the United States, both first when he came, talking about it being this paradise and this dreamland, and then later on kind of becoming more and more disillusioned with it as he experienced kind of more of the other side of the American dream. This is the tree, and this is actually the house where the first city council of Havana happened in 1519. So every single year, this is where people go November 1st and kind of throw coins at the tree, wishing both the island and themselves good luck. It's a really ceremonial place, really spiritual place. And this is right inside of the Plaza Vieja, or Plaza de Armas, which is the main square. So it's kind of the central hub for Old Havana. This, as a person who likes to read, was a paradise for me. These are all old used books that is kind of traded. You can either trade books that you have there and they'll give you some more books, or you can buy books from them. A lot of really interesting things about Cuban history that we don't have access here in the US to. There's both Spanish and English. You can just tell by the colors, the ages of the books, of both like 50s and then later on to more recent. I bought some really interesting things talking about the Cuban experience during the revolution by Che, who is we'll talk about him later on, but he was a really interesting person, so it was really interesting reading his writings while he was going through that process. Cuba, after the revolution triumphed in 1959, they became a communist state, so for the most part they made religion so it wasn't promoted or fairly tolerated. They decided to keep this square. This is Plaza de San Francisco, or St. Francis Square. This cathedral It's one of the biggest ones. Instead of holding regular services there, they turned it into a religious museum for different religious artifacts. And then when Christianity began to become more promoted in the late 90s, or tolerated, I guess, in the late 90s, they regularly opened this house of worship back up for services. There's a really interesting book called Fidel and Religion, if you want to read that, kind of talking about the religious process in Cuba. Plaza Vieja, this is where the old market once was. Savannah at one point was the third largest city in the Americas in the late 1700s, 1600s. So this is kind of where the market square was. There's a lot of really, really interesting things that happened there. Now they've moved that to a different place, kind of more on the port. It's kind of a typical Latin American market. If you have experienced that before, it's a lot of stalls, a lot of people running around, a lot of business being done. It's mostly with foreigners. You will see very few Cubans there. It's really hard to have the extra currency to be able to buy things in that type of setting. So they all use cucs instead of the pesos. But it's a very, very interesting spot. Another thing would be the candy shops. This is a candy shop mostly geared towards tourists. There's a lot of chocolates. They have incredible chocolate. They actually had a hot chocolate shop that was just for chocolate. It was so good. We enjoyed that often. But yeah, it was incredible. So this is kind of the typical stores. They tried to renovate things from the 50s instead of create new things. This would be a drugstore. You can see the computer right there kind of tucked behind the metal cage. Technology is very hard to find. Modern technology is very hard to find there in kind of typical settings, so they really have a high value of it. So this would be just a drugstore. You just go in and buy your medicine. It's a good time. Dominoes, they love dominoes and chess, especially in Cuba. Just some people enjoying their free time. There isn't a lot of free time, but when they do have free time, it's a really communal feel, kind of like nothing I've ever felt before, where the whole community just kind of hangs out together and lives together. Some gentlemen playing chess, enjoying their afternoon, is what it looks like. But chess is another huge favorite. Cubans are probably the most intellectual people I've ever met on a whole. They're extremely well educated. So their games like to reflect that instead of checkers and other things that I play that start with Pokemon. So they really enjoy this type of games. Trumpet player, this is mainly for tourists. It's kind of he's just enjoying himself this afternoon. It's really hard to find, I guess, typical beggars, which I was really interested in. Most of Latin America, there's a lot of poverty, but inside of Cuba, folks like this, I guess, would be very, very rare. They try to keep their people really, really well employed because they're a service to the state. So if they're not helping the state, then they're not really helping anybody. So employment is, I would say, 100% rate of employment, which is really, really cool thing to see. And then this guy may or may not have a state job, or otherwise he would just be doing this on the side as well. You know, cigars, we'll talk about this later on. There's just an old gentleman enjoying his time. Retirement age is pretty old there. You have to serve the state and you have to help the state. That's your role as a citizen there. We're not really sure what this guy's doing. My dad liked the picture, so he took it. We kind of, if you were here for the motorcycle trip, likes taking pictures of people that didn't really see him taking their picture, so it's kind of his thing that he likes to do. We were talking about Cuba being one of the biggest cities in the Americas. Since they're on the port, they really tried to protect against pirates especially, and protect against for Spanish investments as they moved to the old world. So they built this wall and this whole thing around the port. I think it was 1.3 meters thick, which is maybe 8 feet or 10 feet or something like that. This was built with slave labor, and after it was finished, they were never attacked again. So it was kind of a wasted investment, in my opinion, but it's kind of beautiful now. So it's enjoyable. They do cannon firings every Friday? Every once in a while. Yeah. In the evenings. That's safe. Yeah. Off of the port, so they shoot blanks, obviously not real cannons, because that'd be dangerous, into kind of the port and then Old Havana. So we were there. We got there late. It was really hard to see anything. So we decided to look at the town. So this would be a view of Old Havana. Kind of what it would typically be. This is another kind of fortress type of thing, and then very, very narrow streets. And then once you get into here, most of those streets don't allow for cars. They're mainly for pedestrians and for walking. So we got a lot of walking in, especially the second half. But it is really, really interesting to kind of see the old and the new right next to each other.
This is these are some kids that were in a community center that we visited. You would see a number of these community centers, and they're kind of a part of the larger educational picture in Cuba. My profession is as an educator, so I was particularly interested in the schools, the educational system. My first time there, I spent a lot of time in schools. This time, we didn't spend so much time. But it's interesting in Cuba in that they have what is considered the best educational system in all of Latin America. Their average classroom runs about 22 kids versus a norm in Mexico, Central America, South America of anywhere from 40 to 60 kids per classroom. Incredibly high rate of literacy. You've probably heard this in the 98, 99 percentile. Teachers are very, very well educated, not terribly well paid, but their educational system is really, really remarkable. In Cuba, they devote, it's actually about 52% of their expenditures either to medicine or education. Those two, 52% go to medicine or education. So those are two things they do extremely well, in the country of Cuba. This is a shot now outside of Cuba. We tried to do some travels, out of the city. This is actually an area called Cojimar, and this place is famous because this is where Hemingway actually housed his boat. And right at this is kind of a small fort guarding the entrance to the harbor here. These guys are fishing. What you can't see so well right here is actually a bust of Hemingway. Hemingway was actually very, very well respected in the country of Cuba. Castro respected him as well, felt he really understood the country. When Hemingway passed away in 1961, all the fishermen in this particular community took all the props off their boats, actually had them melted down, and they made this bronze bust, of Hemingway. And that's what's on display here. This is Hemingway's house, which is not terribly far, from where he stored his boat, and it was called the Lookout Farm, is what the name of it was. His house is super interesting. We saw all the rooms of it, but every room has mounted animals on the wall. He was a big-time hunter, Africa, and all over the place. And he also, as you know, was an amazing writer, but also a real reader. This home, they said, had in the range of 13,000 books in it. So every room in the house had books. Hemingway had personally selected which books were going to be in which room. He had his own way of organizing those books, for folks that would be there. The house, this is the lookout tower that we were talking about. The house he first moved in about 1938 or so. His third wife, Martha, wanted to get out of the city of Havana and wanted to be in the countryside. So she convinced Hemingway to move here. She thought that he could do even better writing if he had this little writing studio. So she had this built, this lookout tower, and this is where he was supposed to write. Turned out he really didn't like writing there. He preferred to write in his bedroom and when he was walking all over the house, but it was a really cool room. Telescope was there so he could look and see who was coming and figure out if he really wanted to talk to the people that were, that were coming. But this is his boat. The Old Man and the Sea, a famous book, was actually based on some of his experiences with this boat. He had one guide that he used every single time he fished, from Cuba. His name was Gregorio, and Gregorio actually was the main character in The Old Man and the Sea. So Hemingway actually designed this entire boat, and he actually invented some things that had never been done on boats before. It's hard to see here, but way up in the top, he actually invented a steering system where he could be up there trying to spot fish and actually steer the boat at the same time. After he passed away in '61, he actually donated, or actually willed this boat to Gregorio. Unfortunately, Gregorio at that point didn't have enough money to really maintain the boat or use the boat, So it was turned over to the Cuban government. And then in '94, his house became a museum, and they situated the boat there as well too. It was called Pilar, was the name of the boat. We did a little more travel out in the countryside, and these trees just fascinate me. They're called big-bellied palm trees, is what they are, and they actually hold the water in them. So during droughts, they've got enough water to function with. But this would be a typical kind of a barn shed type thing that you would see. There's certain Cuban colors that you'll frequently see in architecture, but this was on our way out into the country. We spent some time at a farm. This is about a 20-acre farm, totally an organic farm. There were about 180 people that worked this 20-acre farm, and it was run as a co-op. If you wanted to work at this farm, which was considered a really choice position, you needed to work there for 3 months or so, and then everybody that worked on the farm would vote on you. They would decide if your work ethic, if your character was good enough, to really join them on this organic farm. Cuba's really interesting from an ecological perspective. They're considered to have one of the smallest footprints of literally any country in the world. And one of the reasons for that is pesticides, fertilizers are extremely expensive and almost unknown, in Cuba. So it's really primarily organic farming, that's going on in the country. At one point, right after the revolution in '59, the Soviet Union had a strong influence over what happened in Cuba, and the Soviets really began to supply a lot of the food products that were necessary in the country. So people, kind of post-revolution, many of them actually started moving to the city. About 60% of people post-revolution lived in cities. After the Soviet Union collapsed, Cuba went into a real difficult period of time. They called it the special period. And during that special period, they realized that we cannot rely on the Soviets anymore. We better start figuring out how to produce some of our own food. And you started to see a lot more farming take place. Now it's actually about 60% of Cubans live in the country and only 40% living in the city. All the farming, like I said, is organic. You don't even find a whole lot of machinery. You can see a little bit of Soviet influence even in some of the clothing, that type of thing. There's even some Vietnamese influence, especially in some of the schools. You'll see Vietnamese interest too. This was our larger group that we traveled with for the first half of our trip. We've got my wife, my son. This is my son-in-law. This is my daughter, Bethel Grad. This is my brave 83-year-old mom. This is my brother, his wife, and then his daughter. So they kind of left us after a week or so, and then that's when we went off and kind of did our own thing and kind of explored. But it was really fun seeing the country through their eyes. Most of them, kind of this group here, had never really traveled much in Central America, or South America, or Cuba. So it was interesting to hear their take on what they were experiencing as well. This is an amazing valley in Cuba. This would be northwest of Havana, about maybe 2.5 to 3 hours. It's called the Valle de Bengales, and it's an area that's really famous for agriculture and especially tobacco farming. These mountains are called mogotes, and they're basically limestone. So there's something about this soil in particular, the limestone and also the climate there, that really helps to produce some of the best tobacco in the world. And that's where a lot of these famous cigars come from, this part of Cuba. This would be a typical kind of little homestead. This is actually a cave. It's called Palenque de Cimarrones, and it's basically a cave that at one point in time housed runaway slaves. Cuba has a pretty dark history, like most countries do, but they were actually the last country in the world to outlaw slavery. It was 1863, and up until that point, slavery was really responsible for much of the sugarcane farming and a lot of the other kind of tough, really nasty type jobs. 1863, slavery was outlawed. And since that time, it's pretty remarkable I guess what I would say is really the lack of racism you find in the country. the races really do seem to function, really well together. So it was kind of a cool thing to see. This is some of the food. Chicken we had. If you do get meat when you're in Cuba, which actually is a bit of a rarity if you are Cuban, if you get meat, it's likely to be chicken, likely to be pork, and then you've always got, you've always got rice. You've got manioc, taro root, and then I fell in love with this Tu-Cola. It's called. It's kind of it's their version on Coca-Cola, which I actually liked a little bit better than Coca-Cola. So, the average Cuban, for the most part, would have almost no meat or no meat, on a meal. Later in the trip, we got to know some Cubans pretty well, and they started sharing with us some of what their diet was. They're all healthy and strong, but meat is a bit of a luxury. This would be the inside of a typical store. You've probably heard about all these stories about lack of products and that type of thing. This is a shot of part of a store. You can see that liquor is fairly common, fairly readable, not terribly expensive. Right next to this store, there was a farmacia, or they call it drogerias there, where folks can come and really get any type of medicine that they need. That's all free. In Cuba, there's a strong emphasis on preventative medicine, and they have the average life expectancy in Cuba is, I think it's like 78.3 years, which is higher than the United States. Cuba has the highest life expectancy of any country in the Americas, with the exception of Canada, which is a little bit higher, and Chile, which is a little bit higher. So their medical care, like I said, is absolutely phenomenal. Every community has their own doctor, and they have the highest ratio of physicians to people of any country in the world. Cuba is a major exporter of physicians as well. A lot of the stuff that happened in Haiti that we read about before, Cuba was actually one of the first countries to send a number of physicians to really help out. That's stuff you never hear about in the American press, but it's true. That they literally have physicians all over the world that are doing some pretty amazing things. This is, I found this kind of intriguing. I was in another store, and I'm just looking at all the products that were there and so forth. They're busy unloading rice. I look where the rice is coming from. It's actually Vietnam is where the rice is coming from. So Cuba still does import a number of things, but they have expanded, what they're actually producing in their own country. This was the largest store that I ever could find in Cuba. My wife and I visited this. This was back in Havana, and it was in an area where there were no tourists at all. It was all just national shopping there. And it actually was an old Woolworths store. You could still see Woolworths, written on the ground. And if you wanted to buy something there, you pretty much had to talk to this person. Whatever was in the case, then you could purchase that product. Average Cuban, they have kind of ration cards, libretas they're called, and they with those ration cards, they can basically get free sugar, salt, flour, a lot of basic necessities. But then if there's more extravagant things they need to buy them. I got pretty kind of big trouble for doing photography work in here. They really didn't like me showing what their stores look like. I got in trouble on a pretty regular basis, but they didn't like me taking pictures of any kind of money-changing places. There were a number of things I was pretty guarded about in terms of what I could take pictures of.
So when most people think of Cuba, especially in the United States, they think of communist cigars and cars. So we'll move on to the cigars part, I guess. That's pretty good, right?
Yeah.
It's creative, yeah. Tobacco drying farm. Right here, this is all tobacco leaves, unless I'm mistaken. So then they would cut it and then bring it to the farm to dry it. And there's a picture right here. This is all dried tobacco. This is the farmer. This was part of our tour, so he did get money from the state for doing this, which didn't really have too big of a part. So after drying the leaves, they then are able to roll it. We might have a picture of that, we might not. This would be the final process. He actually rolled some cigars right there. It was like 5 leaves. This would be an example of one of the best types of cigars. There's a really interesting advertising ploy that they did, talking about the first Europeans who landed in the Americas. The Cuban indigenous folks were smoking this thing, and the first words when they were like, what is that? They're calling them Cohibas. So Cohiba brand decided to make that story up or capitalize on that story, and that's kind of the biggest brand name in the world. These, from what I've been told, are some of the best cigars. I'm under covenant, yeah. So, but yeah, it's a really interesting spot to be at. Usually the Cuban people can't afford these types of things. We later on met some Cuban folks and we ended up buying them some Cohibas, and they were like, we'll never be able to afford these in our life. So it was really, really interesting that they didn't have access to their own products that they were making. So these would all be for foreigners usually. Baseball, national sport in Cuba. They're doing incredible things with baseball. It's kind of, especially for children, the main outlet. We were there during Christmas break, or during winter break there, so none of these kids were in school, so they're all just hanging out on a Thursday morning, I think, just playing baseball with each other. Really, really good athletes come out of this island. Incredible. The Literacy Museum, one of our I think our whole family is interesting part. Cuba, when the revolution triumphed, had an extremely low literacy rate. On an island of 3 million people, 7 million people, something like that, about 700,000 couldn't read. So within Fidel's first year, he had a speech at the United Nations talking about within this year, Cuba will eliminate illiteracy. So within that year, they taught 707,000 people, 100,000 people how to read. They used a lot of train techniques. They also brought kids from the cities who were able to read and kind of train them out to the campos or the farms, and then would work alongside with the farmers, and then in the evening use these lanterns to teach them how to read. So by the end of the year, the whole island was pretty much literate. If you want to go to the next slide. So this would be an example of all the kids getting on the trains being dispersed to different parts of the island. But for me, this was incredible, just to see that in 1 year you can eliminate the literacy if a country actually took it seriously. As proof that they were able to read and write, they had to write this letter to Fidel saying, thank you for this, thank you for teaching me how to read, that sort of thing. I was reading also, looking back on this, preparing for this, but this Cuban model of literacy has actually been used in multiple parts of Africa and South America, and it's been said they've taught about 30 million people how to read using this program. So it's extremely effective. They try to make it change a little bit per culture that they enter into and language and that sort of thing, but it's extremely, extremely effective on teaching folks how to read.
This is a kind of a certain part of Havana. It's actually near where where Fidel has one of his 3 homes. But this is a lot of work that's done by a guy named Jose Fuster. And Fuster is a ceramicist and a painter as well. This is about 1/3 of this imaginary little land that he made. He built this right in a community. It's not made to be just a tourist kind of place. But a lot of his artwork actually started to spread out into the larger community as well. I'll show it in just a second. Here's an example of Fuster's work. He's considered the Picasso of the Caribbean. You can see some Picasso influences there as well too. But this is an example of some of the art that he brought into the community. This particular boat you're looking at here is called the Granma. And the Granma is the boat that Fidel used to go from Mexico to come back over to Cuba. And this is all mosaic. It's just in the community. You've got Fidel, who was obviously one of the leaders of the revolution. You've got Che, who was one of the leaders as well. And then you've got Camilo here, Cienfuegos. This particular boat was what was used to really launch the successful Cuban Revolution. Came from Mexico. They had 82 people on board this boat. By the time they landed in an area called the Sierra Maestras, which is the identical area that Jose Marti landed in when he led the revolution. So when they landed in the Sierra Maestras, they went from 82 people down to basically 20. Okay? And the revolution actually started to grow as they kind of progressed through the countryside. Eventually, made it all the way to Havana. This was a professor that we listened to who was extremely interested. My wife's getting some information from here. Dr. Martha Nunez, and she talked a lot about the economy in Cuba. And most interesting was she talked about what Cuba calls the venues of equity. And there's certain areas that they really want to be sure that there's equitable access to. One of those venues is education. Everybody receives high quality education. Medical care is one of the venues. Everybody has good medical care. Another venue was Social Security. Another venue, which I thought was interesting, was actually sports. They wanted equal access to that. And then the other venue was actually culture. So if you want to go to a play or visit a museum, basically everybody has access to those things. So she shared some really interesting insights with us. I'm a bit of a Hemingway fan. My wife is as well. So we had to visit the Floridita in Havana. This is the famous bar that that Hemingway went to. This is a life-size statue of him there. What's interesting is, like I said before, Fidel was a big fan of Hemingway. You can see Fidel and Hemingway here. At this point, Hemingway had just won a major fishing competition, and Fidel was proud of him. After the revolution, most people, a lot of folks that were not Cuban left the country. Hemingway actually stayed and was really welcomed, by the Cuban government. This was the place that Hemingway lived for the most part. Hotel Ambos Mundos, kind of both worlds. He loved being in the town, close to his bar. Eventually, his wife convinced him to kind of buy this, farm outside of town. But so we spent a little time in there. I also, during this trip, worked as what's called an equity photographer. And there's a group in Australia that believes that everyday folks all over the world should have access to photos of themselves and their families. What they do is they will provide you with this camera. It's basically a Polaroid, is what it is. And then you get some film. They give you the film. And then you take pictures and then just give them to the folks that live there. We learned about this when we were in Uruguay, and I applied to be an equity photographer. You need to be kind of semi-professional, professional. They took me in, sent me my camera. Ironically, they called it Baldy. That was the name of my camera. So I had Baldy to kind of carry with me. But we were in this home that was designed for older people and for kids. Really interesting mix. And I started taking pictures, and these older people just went nuts. They really wanted their photo taken. And I went through pretty much all the photos or all the film that I had. I was joking with my family that when I get to be old and I need to be in a place like this, send me here. These people were amazing. They were alive intellectually, and the place had a great feel. So I'm ready to go there when my time comes. But anyhow, some of my photography made it into this book, which was a cool thing. They're all a nonprofit organization. Anybody interested in doing any of this work, let me know. You need to be traveling to a country where people just can't really afford photos, so that limits you a bit as to where you want to go. This was one of the ladies that I photographed. Man, I just fell in love with her. I could have spent the whole day just kind of working with her. A lot of, I wouldn't say a lot, but some very high quality museums in Havana. This is the Museo de Bellas Artes, about 12,000 pieces there. No, 1,200 pieces there, about 5 floors, an amazing museum. Top 3, are Cuban artists. Here's one. Slavery, unfortunately, has a long history. In Cuba, we visited. It was called the Casa de Africa, and learned a lot about slavery practices, that went on. Santeria is also a really strong presence, in Cuba. It's a religion that's been practiced for about 300 years in Cuba, and it's still going very strong. It's a mix of Catholicism and a religion that came out of a particular part of Africa, kind of a part in Nigeria. So it's you still see practitioners of it. It has a very, very strong influence. You probably got in Cuba probably about 45 other religions that are practiced. Many of them actually have African roots originally.
This would be in the presidential palace. After the revolution triumphed, they turned it into the kind of museum of the revolution. This would be a bust of Jose Marti. Batista, while he was the president, spent most of his time here. These bullet holes were actually from a failed attempt to kind of seize this building in 1957, I think. That was a student group that actually got all the way to his office to kind of assassinate him and overthrow that government. And he escaped through a trapdoor underneath his desk. So it's kind of interesting. And then this, of course, is Fidel. We've mentioned him a couple times. Probably one of the most intellectual people Cuba's ever produced. Got a law degree. Attempted the revolution in 1953, with a group called the July 26th movement. That was actually stopped. Their attempt just was horrible. He didn't really plan it out the best. From that, he was imprisoned. He gave a really famous speech called "History Will Absolve Me." That was about 4 hours long for his defense. He was his own defense lawyer. So he's kind of really prideful with that, I guess. But he was actually imprisoned, and then through a lot of international kind of pressure on Batista, he actually released all of the political prisoners at the time. So then Fidel took off to Mexico, was exiled there for 2 years, which is where he met up with his brother, and then Che, who was a circus clown actually at the time, kind of on the street. So that's funny. If you want to move on, these are the other two bigger people. This is Che Guevara, who was born in Argentina, was part of the Guatemalan little spat, wrote the Motorcycle Diaries, probably known as the intellectual, even more so than Fidel, also the idealist. Later, talking with the Cuban folks, they thought that if Che had stayed, then the island would have been a lot better. And really, it was sad that he left. He was captured and killed in Bolivia by the CIA. And then Camilo Cienfuegos was another one of the original group. He was not so socialist or to the left as the rest of them. The Che and Fidel were really nice about calling him confused. He was a capitalist, but so he made it almost to the end, and then was killed. Kind of interestingly, I think his plane crashed or something like that. I'm not super sure, but it is really, really interesting. But he's also revered as kind of one of the heroes of the revolution.
We're a little bit after 11, so if you need to leave, feel free to. Conor and I will go for probably another 5, 6, 7 minutes. If you want to stay, that's great. If you would like to read any more detailed type things, I've got a pretty elaborate photo log on this particular site. So if you want to see a bunch more photos, read some more, you can certainly do that too. The Hotel Nacional, very famous in Havana. This is a shot of the inside of it. It has, it's had multiple owners. Meyer Lansky, kind of mafia fame days, was heavily involved with it for a while too. You can stay here. It's just a beautiful place. We didn't stay there obviously, but it was fun to see. Then we kind of took off on our own. When we take off on our own, we like to travel like everyday people do, so we normally just travel by bus. Buying a bus ticket to travel in Cuba is a pretty interesting event. It involves going to 3 different people. Everything is done, everything is handwritten. She's writing something on a ticket that 3 different people handled before I went. So we decided to go from Havana out to an area it's known as a Varadero. It's known as a tourist area, but the place we stayed wasn't really touristy. So it took about half an hour to buy a bus ticket, cost about $10 a person, and then we boarded our bus. Left Havana. We're going by this type of thing. The movement Conor was talking about, you still would see a lot of signage, for that all around. This was typical Cuban housing that was really during the Soviet era. So from '59 until when the Soviets really experienced a lot of difficulties, kind of like 1990s or so, there was a lot of construction that looked like this. Not typical Cuban construction, very Soviet influence, often kind of 5 floors to maybe 8 floors in size, very, very tiny. Most of these buildings were built by people, just average Cubans, that didn't have a lot of specialized training. So the quality of some of these buildings, is a bit suspect in some way. This is Varadero. So this is actually a peninsula that's about 30 kilometers long. This would be considered probably the main tourist area in Cuba. You have many, many, many European tourists that come here, Canadian tourists that come. There's about 60 hotels that are here. What's interesting, though, the Cuban government does not allow an outside country to have a majority interest in a hotel. Like Mexico, for example, where we've traveled a lot, you'll have total ownership by outside countries. The Cuban government says if say you're a French company, the most you can own of any of your hotels is 49%. The Cuban government maintains a 51% ownership. We chose to not stay in any of these fancy hotels. We actually stayed with a Cuban family. We arranged this through the internet. You can't really pay until you get there. So we were like wondering, is this place really going to be there? And that kind of thing. But this is the family that we stayed with, husband and wife, these two. This is what's called a casa particular. You may have heard of those, but those are private houses that anybody can stay in. Very inexpensive, anywhere from 10 bucks a night to maybe 35 a night. We chose to do it just so we could talk with people, that really live in the area. You can eat at kind of government-funded type restaurants, or you can go to places that are called paladars. And a paladar is run by typically a Cuban family. They have to have a special license to do it, and typically the food they serve is better than the quality of food that you would just find, by any Cuban type restaurant. You never know what the prices are going to be. We just got burned on this place. We went there one night, and we're used to paying almost nothing for food, and I think we were 20 bucks a person or something, and we said, this is nice right now, we're not coming here again. We found another paladar that was just a fraction of the price where the food was actually better, but these are interesting options. The Cuban government right now is actually starting to privatize a number of things. There's 180, I think it's 181 different businesses that you can start if you're a Cuban, and that's a fairly recent development. So you see all these little entrepreneurial things starting to pop up. Little like storefront things where they're selling some clothes or selling food, or it's just a fascinating country to try to figure out, what's this mix of kind of communism with capitalism. And it's just, I've never been in a more intriguing country, and I still don't feel like I understand, what's going on. We like to see the extremes in wealth sometimes too. This is a mansion, it's called Xanadu. It was built by the DuPonts. This is out on that peninsula. It actually has its own golf course, the only golf course in all of Cuba. You find at this mansion. So you've got marble flooring, you've got furniture that's all handmade, imported, type things. This is a view, looking out over the water. I think we had a 2 cola here. We didn't eat there. We didn't do anything else. We're back to reality a little bit now. So Conor.
Yep. After a nice little skirt to the DuPont mansion, we decided to buy some food that we could actually afford. This was a place called Supermachi, which we found about halfway through our second week. And then we lived on this place. It was incredible. It was probably two meals a day here. This plate is all beef and then rice, and then you could get some other things to go along with it. But that would be about $2 maybe, and that would feed either him and I, or my brother-in-law and I, or him and my brother-in-law. We both eat a lot. So it was incredible food, incredible value. This was the first place that I saw that used both the Cuban pesos and then the kooks. So most of the people that were there is kind of on this abandoned street that we were out late walking on. Most of the people there were Cubans, kind of buying food for their family for like the special night, whatever night that would be. So it was really interesting. That was the place where it kind of started to feel more like we were trying to be invested in the culture as much as we could be. And then we got scooters, so that died really fast, but we went back to there later. We like things with 2 wheels, so we rented some scooters and then took off. We actually went to a cave. We got stopped by the police on the way back, which was really embarrassing. We didn't do anything wrong. They said we did. It was no good. But before that happened, we got to this cave and we swam. Color is absolutely beautiful. Something I absolutely love about Latin America is there's not all these rules about what you can and can't do. So we kind of saw this cave. We had read about this cave. We're like, okay. So then we kind of ran down the really wet stone steps and jumped in, and it was really cold, really good though. and just enjoyed our afternoon there. There's some tours that went there, and then there's also a lot of Cuban folks hanging out there. We were right on the beach, so we spent most of our time on the beach, and we're getting close to the end. But these two guys, along with some other folks, were construction workers for a public company building a private hotel. And it was one of their birthdays, so they're out, just on the beach having a good time. And my sister actually started talking to them. And my sister's an incredible Spanish speaker, so she was doing a lot of the translation, and we were trying to jump in and failing most of the time. But we probably had an 8-hour conversation between this day and the next day, but it was kind of talking a lot more about these. We had a bunch of realities that we had thought that Cuba was this perfect place. We're talking about free education, free medicine, all that sort of thing. But we haven't really heard about the economic side, which has been really, really hard for these folks. They both have college education. One of them has a master's degree in education, and decided to work construction because he ends up getting paid more for that versus working as a teacher. You do get ration cards, and then you get about $15 of free money per month. So that's to supplement your food for the most part. So that's a really, really, really hard reality that we talked about with them. And then they had all these expectations of the U.S. being this absolutely perfect place. So it was a really interesting dialogue, just kind of challenging each other's perceptions of each other's lands. And I was really thankful for these folks. We actually took a picture with Baldy, the camera, and gave it to them, and they were really thankful because they would always have a token to remember us by and the conversations that we had with them. But it was a really impactful time, and a lot of things got challenged with both of us. Which brings me back to what I've always tried to say, if you talk to people, you'll actually learn more than kind of doing anything else when you travel. So for me, it really validated that and kind of helped me to pursue continuing conversations with folks. And then we're nearing the end, I promise.
I'm just going to throw in one comment real quick here, too. The whole time we were talking with these guys, they were really quite nervous, and they would be looking around, and it was actually illegal for them to be talking to American tourists. And they were concerned that people were watching, and they took a chance at it. So we said, well, what could happen, if you get caught talking to us? Basically, it'd be a night in prison is what they would experience. We also felt like we were able to get some taxi drivers to really open up to, and they also were fairly nervous once they started saying anything that was at all critical of the Cuban government. The last day that my wife and I were there, we were actually driving in a taxi cab. I was in front, my wife was in the back. We were talking, and I started asking a bunch of pretty probing questions about what day-to-day life is like. And the taxi driver is busy talking in this old Lada. He's looking at me, he's talking to my wife all at the same time, kind of driving. And then he's starting to really lay out what life was like, and then he sees this fancy car kind of coming by, and immediately he just started to kind of panic and kind of went like that, and then kind of signaled, well, handcuffs, for some of what he was talking about. So freedom of speech, is something that's, it's not to be taken for granted, here, or they certainly don't have it. I think it's more so when they get talking real critically about the government, where there are issues.
Yeah, just closing out, this was another example of the Casa Particular. They tried really hard to find one that was only in a Cuban residence, so they were the only tourists that they saw that whole night they were there. Brock and Nina and I decided to stay another night, and then came back, and that's when Snowmageddon happened, when it was -40. And I almost missed a few days of my J-term class, but made it back in time, so I passed. But anyways, I will never do that again. But they really enjoyed this house and this place, and really went out and hung out with people as much as they could. And then this is a quote from him. This is "Hasta la victoria siempre," till the victory always. Hopefully that's right, my Spanish instructor. Yes. So just with that, I don't know. Keep in mind the differences, and keep in mind, I don't know, I'm too tired to be wise, I guess, right now. But just the paradoxes all around, and try and challenge those as much as you can, and go try and understand the people as much as you can wherever you go to. That's my wisdom for the morning. Do you have anything?
No, I would just say that if you ever want to talk further with any of us, we'd love to. You can see a lot more kind of on this site as well. If you've never read about our motorcycle trip to Argentina, you'll find it on that site too. But I am totally mystified by the country still to this point. It's an intriguing, very complex, very complicated country that is literally changing by the day. And it's going to be fun to see what unfolds. We were, I think, really blessed to be there at a time before it's totally overrun, with American tourists, and so it was really nice to see it at this point in history. I had a chance to travel in China before it had become really accessible, and that was a unique opportunity too. So I would encourage you to go. Anybody interested in going, I can talk with you about how to get a license to go. I can suggest a tour agency, that type of thing too. Anybody interested in the Latin American Studies program, we can certainly talk about that as well too. It's an option for the Guatemala term and the Spain term program, for students too. Any general questions, or you guys you're hardcore? It's like 20 minutes after 11 here, but feel free to leave, or any general questions.
How long were you there?
It was a whopping 16 days total. And then I was there for a period of time before, so not real long. Okay. Other general questions? Yep, Joe?
Do you think if the embargo is lifted that it'll transform or accelerate the change or change the country a lot, or what?
I think it will change it. I think the Cubans, and Conor alluded to this, are is a group of people, I think, extremely intelligent, and they are studies of history. My previous trip to Cuba, I had a chance to hear from and talk with a pretty leading governmental official, and he talked a lot about how they've studied these other governmental systems throughout the world. They know more about America than the average American knows. So I think, this is just my opinion, but I think at some point they have the potential of creating a governmental system that's maybe unlike anything the world has ever seen before. They're very careful about being exploited. That's happened to them. They got burned by the Soviets. They obviously have been burned by the U.S. and Batista. So I think they're going to be fairly savvy, about what happens. I don't anticipate any major changes happening until Fidel passes away. He's 87 right now. Raul's 82. Raul is the president. But until Fidel passes away, the influence of they're sometimes called the Cuban Mafia, which are based in Miami, a lot of political influence. So I think until Fidel passes away, I think the chances of normalization of relationships is actually pretty remote. Obama's done some interesting things. He's changed a lot of the travel restrictions, 2009, 2011. So he's helped make some progress in that area. But I think it's inevitably coming. I mean, it's 53 years, that boycott's been taking place. So the longest standing one in history. So it will change at some point in time. Yep, Sandy?
When I was there in 2007, in Havana, there were billboards all over the place, never for purchasing anything, nothing materialistic, but political in nature. And the number of anti-Bush billboards was interesting. What do they have now? You don't find as much. You still will see some of those billboards kind of promoting the government in Cuba and that type of thing. They generally are fans of Obama. They particularly did not like Bush. Reagan, who, we're clearly not a big fan of Reagan. So you see a little bit of less what would appear to be real overt propaganda. A little bit less of that. Yeah. Yep.
I just want to say too, I think it kind of will depend on the Cuban American population here in this country. I think they have a lot of say and influence on what's going to affect how the U.S. relates to Cuba. I think that's particularly true even after Fidel dies, and so that's a whole another part of the complexity. Because when people left there, they thought they were going to be back in 6 months when everything blew over. And so that's a whole different kind of relationship than any other group that chose to exile themselves here for political reasons, I believe. And so I think that's going to be a big piece to play. Although more Cuban Americans will be they go back now to visit family and take things. But I do think that that's another piece that we'll just have to see how that plays out.
There's a different sentiment among younger Cuban Americans than older Cuban Americans too. Younger Cuban Americans generally are more in favor of normalization. Ones that remember having their homes, properties taken away, very, very animate, strong feelings. Yeah, Senator?
I think in addition to just what was said, if you look at how the United States resumed diplomatic relations with China, it's so amazing. China was very communist at that time. They organized the meeting secretly. There's a documentary that PBS produced. Henry Kissinger went to India, and then they said he was sick. Meanwhile, they flew him secretly to China. He went and planned for the meeting. So in terms of American foreign relations, I think America is more concerned about her national interests rather than some. The day we realize that there's going to be, if Cuba was really having a big market like China, I know if other countries are going there and they're making a lot of money, American corporations will put more pressure on the U.S. government. And they would go into U.S. history and come up with some kind of principle to justify that, that we should go there. Just like we went to war in Iraq, we came up with some kind of reason to justify that. So I'm hoping that, I truly believe that if the U.S. government will resume diplomatic relations with Cuba, it will help the country more to kind of change. But as it is now, we are limited in terms of how much it is.
Any other questions? Otherwise, we need to bring this to an end at some point. But we love talking about it, as you figured out. So feel free just to talk.